What if everything you believed about your family was a lie? Madeline Carter was cast out, disinherited, and branded the outsider in her own bloodline. But years later, a mysterious letter, a hidden will, and a DNA test ignite her return. Beneath the chandeliers of a southern estate lies a chilling truth, one that could destroy the Carter legacy forever. This is a story of buried secrets, courtroom battles, and the quiet revenge of a woman no one saw coming. Stay until the end, because justice, like family, is never what it seems. What if everything you believed about your family was a lie? Madeline Cooper was cast out, erased from her family's legacy, and told she never belonged. But years later, a hidden letter and a buried truth send her on a relentless journey back to confront the lies, expose the betrayal, and reclaim the life that was stolen from her. In a world where bloodlines are currency and silence is power, one woman dares to rewrite her name. This is not just revenge. This is justice. Served cold and on her own terms. It was raining again. Not the kind of gentle drizzle that whispered on rooftops, but a relentless downpour that turned sidewalks into rivers and swallowed headlights in sheets of gray. Madeline Cooper balanced a stack of pizza boxes under her umbrella, her hands aching from the morning barista shift and the chill that had seeped into her bones. She could feel her socks squishing inside worn sneakers as she stepped up the slick stone walkway of a mansion that looked like it belonged on a real estate magazine cover. The party inside thumped with bass-heavy music. Laughter spilled out through the oversized windows, carefree, obnoxious. A young man in a backwards cap opened the door, eyes flicking over her soaked uniform before barking, "Pizza's here!" over his shoulder. He handed her $80.00 for a $78.50 order and turned away before she could say anything. A joke floated out from inside. "Make sure she waits in the rain while we find the paper plates." Someone laughed hard. Madeline turned back toward her car, her fingers clenched tight around the damp tip money. Rain trickled down the back of her neck as she unlocked the driver's side. The windshield wipers were useless against the torrent, smearing water more than clearing it. This was the last delivery of the night, just one more round of exhaustion before she could crawl back into her fourth-floor walk-up and count out how much of her week's earnings she could spare for groceries. She didn't hear him at first. Her name sounded foreign against the noise of the storm. "Madeline? Madeline Cooper!" She turned slowly. Under a wide black umbrella stood a tall man in a dark wool coat, his face half lit by the street lamp. He looked older than the version she remembered, more gray at the temples, deeper lines bracketing his mouth. But there was no mistaking the man who used to make her paper airplanes when her parents were too busy arguing in the kitchen. "Uncle Raymond?" The words came out hoarse. She blinked hard, unsure if she was hallucinating from sleep deprivation. "You're delivering pizzas?" he asked, stepping closer, concern flashing across his face. Madeline nodded slowly. "It's my second job." His brow furrowed. "What happened to art school?" She didn't answer, not at first. What could she say? That everything had unraveled quietly? That she had been cut from her own story long before she realized it? Raymond gestured toward a parked sedan down the street. "There's a 24-hour diner 10 minutes from here. Let me buy you coffee. Just talk to me, Madeline." She hesitated. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Some people just don't belong in your life. But Raymond's voice, his expression, carried none of the smooth manipulation she had grown used to navigating. It was the first real concern anyone in her family had shown her in years. "Out of," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Let me call my boss." 30 minutes later, they sat across from each other in a corner booth at the Starlight Diner, steam rising from mugs of hot chocolate. Madeline had changed into a dry sweater Raymond found in his car, but her jeans still clung damply to her legs. She stared at her hands, at the chipped blue nail polish, at the calluses forming along her palms. "I haven't seen you since," she started, then trailed off. The last time had been an argument, raised voices behind a closed door. her father's angry silhouette, a slammed door. "I never wanted to disappear," Raymond said gently, "but your father made it clear I wasn't welcome. But staying away was the least damaging thing I could do." Madeline looked up. "Did you know I never got to use my college fund? They gave it to Ethan for an app. It failed in 3 months." Raymond's face tightened. "He told me you'd gotten into Parsons." "I did," she said, "with partial scholarship, but I couldn't cover the rest." She didn't know what prompted her to keep talking. Maybe it was the warmth of the booth, the weariness, the rain still echoing faintly in her ears, or maybe it was that she needed someone to know finally, fully, what had happened. She told him everything. The missed birthdays, the one-sided sacrifices, the double shifts, the bone-deep exhaustion of being invisible in your own family. Raymond didn't interrupt, didn't offer excuses. When she finished, he looked at her the same way he had when she was 6 years old and scraped her knee at the park. Like she mattered. "You shouldn't be delivering pizzas at midnight," he said softly. "You have talent, Madeline. I remember your drawings." She almost snapped back. "I'm not looking for pity." But the words lodged in her throat. He didn't pity her. He respected her. Maybe even admired her. That was harder to accept. Raymond slid a business card across the table. "We're looking for new perspectives in our design department at Raycom. If you're interested, I'll arrange an interview." Madeline stared at the card. Her heart thudded, not with hope, not yet, but with something older. Something like possibility. She turned the card over in her hand again and again. Raycom Technologies. She knew the name. Anyone working even remotely in design knew it. Innovative, competitive, highly selective. They didn't hire pizza delivery girls with student debt and resumes filled with retail shifts and freelance gigs under pseudonyms. "You think I'm qualified?" she asked, the question barely more than a whisper. Raymond didn't hesitate. "I think you're ready. But that's not what matters. What matters is, do you want it?" She looked down at the business card. Wanting had always been dangerous. Wanting got you hurt. Wanting meant risking rejection again. She nodded anyway. "I'll think about it." "Good," he said, leaning back. "That's all I ask." He didn't press, just paid the bill and walked her to her car, umbrella still shielding them both from the lingering rain. She noticed then how understated he was. No flashy watch, no overconfident swagger. Just quiet strength. She hadn't realized how much she craved that presence until it returned, unannounced, into her life. At the driver's door, he paused. "Whatever you decide, Madeline, call me. You don't have to keep doing this alone." The words struck her harder than expected, not because they were grand or poetic, but because no one in her family had ever said them. Not like that. Not as a promise with no strings. She didn't sleep that night. Her mind replayed the diner conversation in loops as the rain slowed into a hush outside her window. By dawn, the card was still on her nightstand, resting beside her phone and the leftover coins from the night's deliveries. A lifeline or a test, she couldn't tell. 3 days passed before she made the call. She'd spent those days researching everything she could about Raycom. Their branding, their campaigns, the kind of designers they hired. She expected intimidation, but found herself strangely exhilarated. They valued authenticity. Thoughtful interfaces. User first. Storytelling. She could do that. She'd been doing that. Only in the shadows, under fake names, for clients who paid in grocery money and Venmo transfers. When she finally dialed the number, Raymond's assistant picked up immediately. "He's been expecting your call," she said before transferring her. "Madeline," Raymond answered, his voice warm. "Have you thought about what we discussed?" "I have," she said, fingers gripping the phone cord tightly. "I'm interested. But I have one condition." "I'm listening." "If I get this job, if I get an interview, it has to be because I'm good, not Because I'm your niece. No nepotism, no favors." There was a pause on the line. Then came a soft chuckle. "You really are nothing like your father." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. "Come in tomorrow," he said. 10 a.m. downtown office. Bring your portfolio. You'll meet Jessica Chen. She's our design director." "I've heard of her," Madeline said. "She's intimidating." "Brilliant, demanding, and fair," Raymond corrected. "She doesn't care who you're related to. If anything, she'll scrutinize you harder because of me." That wasn't comforting, but it was honest. And that counted for something. She hung up and spent the rest of the night in a frenzy, printing, compiling, editing her modest portfolio until her fingers ached. She wasn't proud of every piece, but they were hers. Late-night designs made between shifts, branding work for neighborhood cafes, social media graphics for student groups she was never a part of. It wasn't polished, but it was real. The next morning, she stood outside Raycom's headquarters, staring up at 10 floors of glass and steel. The building felt like another planet, sleek and humming with purpose. Inside, she passed a green living wall and digital touchscreens displaying their latest campaigns. Her reflection looked too small, too hopeful. Raymond greeted her in the lobby, dressed in the same unassuming calm she now associated with safety. He didn't walk her up, just handed her a visitor's badge and said, "Go knock their socks off." Madeline nodded and entered the elevator alone. The 24th floor was quiet, lined with glass conference rooms and workspaces bathed in natural light. At the far end, a woman with sharp eyes and a sleek bob stood reviewing something on a tablet. Jessica Chen. They shook hands. Jessica's grip was firm, unreadable. "Let's see what you've got," she said simply. "No small talk, no indulgence." Madeline laid out her portfolio. Her heart thudded in her chest as Jessica turned each page with surgical focus, occasionally glancing up with a question or comment. "Your layout instincts are strong. Typography needs work. Nice use of color here. This feels underdeveloped. Why that iconography?" Madeline answered every question, nerves steadying with each minute. This was the most professional critique she'd ever received. It was terrifying and thrilling. After nearly an hour, Jessica closed the binder. "You've got potential and discipline. That's a rare combo. We have an internship program, paid, 3 months, possibility for a permanent role after." Madeline inhaled. When would it start? "Next Monday, business hours. You'll be working on live projects." Jessica stood. "Raymond wants me to hire you outright." "I don't do that." "You'll earn your place here, Madeline." "That's all I've ever wanted," she said. Jessica handed her a folder. "Paperwork's inside. Fill it out before you leave." As she left the room, her pulse still racing, Madeline didn't know what would come next. But for the first time in years, she wasn't surviving, she was starting. The internship began with silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, but a focused hum of keystrokes and shifting chairs, punctuated by soft murmurs over collaborative sketches. Raycom's design floor felt like a different universe. Clean, deliberate, and humming with possibility. Madeline's desk was tucked near a sunlit corner, overlooking a street that bustled far below. She had a nameplate now. Temporary, laminated, but it existed. Her first days passed in observation, shadowing junior designers, sitting in on meetings, absorbing the cadence of conversations filled with terms like user empathy, micro-interactions, and visual hierarchy. It was a language she understood in fragments, like echoes from a version of herself that had never been forced to grow up too fast. Jessica checked in briefly but intensely. "Don't try to impress me," she said. "Impress the work." Madeline took that as gospel. She stayed late, she watched tutorials, she made notes in the margins of her notebooks about color theory, layout spacing, and the quiet confidence of people who hadn't spent the last 4 years delivering pizzas just to stay afloat. Some nights she forgot to eat. Other nights she didn't feel hungry at all. Outside Raycom, life demanded sacrifices. Madeline stepped back from Gino's Pizza altogether. Her manager, predictably annoyed, offered no farewell. At Brewington's, Zoe insisted she stay on for weekend shifts. "You need coffee, and I need someone who can restock pastry trays without crying." "I haven't cried over a croissant since last summer," Madeline replied. "Growth," Zoe said with a wink. But the financial pressure was real. Even with a small stipend, rent didn't change, utilities didn't care about personal progress. She redid her budget weekly, cut every non-essential, walked more, cooked cheap, and yet for the first time the exhaustion felt earned. Purposeful, like she was building something instead of barely holding it together. Raymond remained a quiet presence. At work, he kept his distance, save for a few casual hallway greetings or quick glances across meetings. But on Friday evenings, he sometimes sent her short emails with links to design articles or recommended books. Once, he left a post-it on her desk that read, "Great typography solves more problems than people realize." There was something healing in his restraint. He didn't force conversations. He didn't ask her to open up. He just let her exist in this new version of herself, free from demands or expectations. Still, the past lingered. One Saturday morning, after a long shift at Brewington's, Madeline walked into her apartment to find a voicemail blinking on her answering machine. Her mother's voice, overly bright. "Sweetheart, just calling to check in. Ethan's doing well. He's got this new subscription box idea for pet owners. So clever. Anyway, we're having dinner next week. Come if you're free." No mention of her internship, no questions, just another update on the golden child. She sat on the couch, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily overhead. That old weight returned. A dull ache behind her ribs, like being erased in slow motion. She didn't call back. Instead, she poured herself a glass of water and opened her sketchbook. It was nearly full now. Scribbles, thumbnail layouts, bits of color swatches. Evidence that her hands were building something real. The next week at Raycom, Jessica handed her a live task. "We need social media graphics for an upcoming product update. Messaging's in the brief. You've got 2 days." Madeline blinked. "Me?" Jessica's tone was even. "Yes, you. This is the job, Madeline. You ready? Or not?" "I'm ready." She wasn't sure she was, but she became ready. The next 48 hours blurred. She analyzed typefaces, compared compositions, spent her lunch breaks tweaking gradients and margins. When she turned in the final version, her palms were damp with nerves. Jessica reviewed it in silence, then looked up. "This is clean. On jag, confident, you've got a good eye." Madeline barely remembered walking back to her desk. Later that day, she received an email from the marketing director. One sentence. "Great work, Madeline. You made us look better than we are." She read it 3 times. That night, alone in her apartment, Madeline allowed herself one indulgence. She ordered Thai food, delivery, not pickup, and lit a candle Zoe had given her for manifesting boss energy. She sat by the window, eating noodles in silence, watching taillights disappear into the night. Maybe, she thought, this was the start of being seen. The following Monday brought a shift. Madeline arrived early, as usual, but this time the receptionist handed her an envelope, heavy paper, her name in careful script. Inside was a formal invitation to a Raycom Gala, an annual company event held at an art gallery downtown. Dress code, cocktail attire. Guest list, everyone. Her chest tightened. She hadn't owned a cocktail dress in years. Her last formal wear had been borrowed for her high school graduation, and that gown now hung unused at her mother's house, if it hadn't already been tossed. But what truly unnerved her wasn't the dress code. It was the note, scrawled at the bottom in Raymond's handwriting. "Come. It's time." What did he mean by that? That week, she avoided asking. She buried herself in work, keeping her head down, producing polished wireframes and getting nods of approval from colleagues, but the thought of the gala loomed large. Zoe was the one who finally dragged her into a thrift shop 2 days before the event, marching her through rows of satin, sequins, and quiet regrets. They found a navy blue slip dress that fit like it had been waiting for her. Madeline stared at herself in the mirror, almost not recognizing the woman looking back. Shoulders drawn, but chin lifted. A survivor, not a shadow. When Saturday night arrived, she stood outside the gallery's tall glass doors, breath fogging slightly in the cold air. Inside, the space glowed with warm light and laughter, people in sleek suits, name tags glittering, champagne flutes clinking. Music played softly, the kind you feel more than hear. She stepped inside. Almost immediately, a few co-workers greeted her. Some complimented her design work, others just smiled, surprised she showed up. Jessica raised a glass from across the room. But it was Raymond who approached with quiet gravity, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit. "You clean up well," he said gently. She almost laughed, but the moment was too thick for humor. "Why did you want me here?" He glanced around, then gestured toward a quieter corner of the gallery. Paintings lined the walls, abstract works in bold strokes, raw and layered. He stood beside a large canvas, its dark center radiating outward like a wound trying to heal. "I wasn't sure when to tell you this," he began, voice low, "but your adoptive father, he reached out last month." Madeline's breath hitched. "He what?" "He emailed. Asked if I'd seen you. Said your mother mentioned you'd started here, he wanted to meet, said he had regrets." Her jaw tightened. "And what did you say?" "I said I'd pass along the message, that the decision was yours." 1,000 responses surged through her, rage, disbelief, exhaustion, but above all, the sick familiarity of being summoned, again, on someone else's terms. "He didn't have regrets when he sold my scholarship out from under me, or when he told me to leave with a trash bag full of clothes." "I know," Raymond said, eyes steady. "I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm telling you that people like him don't change. They just run out of people to blame." Madeline stared at the painting, at its rawness. She remembered standing in the rain with her boxes, her mother's silence, Ethan's smug avoidance, the sense that she was never meant to return. And now, an invitation? No apology? No ownership, just another calculated step? "I don't want to meet him," she said, her voice clear. "Then don't," Raymond replied. "But if you ever do, it should be because you're ready to stand on your own ground, not because he finally decided to acknowledge it exists." For the rest of the evening, Madeline drifted through the event like someone learning to inhabit their own body again. She made small talk. She accepted compliments. She didn't flinch when people asked about her background, and when she left the gallery, heels clicking softly on the sidewalk, she realized something simple but irreversible. Her father no longer held the narrative. He wasn't the author anymore. She was. The next morning, Madeline sat at her kitchen table, fingers hovering over her laptop. An email draft blinked on the screen. The subject line read, "Regarding your message." She deleted the draft. Instead, she opened a new document, a portfolio in progress. Title, Reclaimed. She was done answering. From now on, she was telling. The first snow came early that year. Madeline watched it fall from her apartment window, tiny flecks dusting the fire escape and the rooftops beyond. The city looked softer under the weight of winter, like it had forgotten, momentarily, how to be cruel. But she hadn't forgotten. A week had passed since the gala, since Raymond had delivered her father's cowardly olive branch, since she'd chosen silence. And with that silence came clarity. For the first time in years, she felt the ground firming beneath her feet. Her choices no longer had to circle back to what the Coopers wanted, or didn't. Raycom had assigned her to a new internal branding initiative, an archive project for legacy designs dating back to the early days of the company. Most employees passed it off as tedious grunt work. Madeline, however, saw a different opportunity: access to old company files, executive memos, legal correspondences. Hidden within those digital piles could be the breadcrumbs she needed. She had a theory. Her mother, Eleanor, had never signed that will of her own volition. Madeline remembered her. The way she moved through the world like someone always halfway into a whisper. The way her eyes drifted toward Madeline with both love and restraint, as if holding something in. Her death, sudden and sanitized as it was labeled heart failure, had always felt like a closing door no one wanted to look behind. Raycom's records held years of confidential interactions between Eleanor and Charles, personal assistants, meeting notes, even unused contracts for Madeline's educational fund. And buried within a mislabeled folder dated October 2009 was a scanned PDF that made her hands tremble. It was a letter, handwritten, dated 2 months before her mother's death. To whom it may concern, in the event of any inquiry regarding the distribution of my personal estate, please note that I, Eleanor Whitman Cooper, have set aside a separate fund in trust for my daughter Madeline Elizabeth Cooper, not to be managed by Charles A. Cooper or any direct associate. The letter continued with meticulous instructions, a signature, a notary stamp. But this letter had never surfaced. It had never been mentioned during the reading of Eleanor's will. The original document, if it existed in legal records, had likely been buried or destroyed. And then there was a scribbled annotation in the margin. A different hand spoke to Richard T. Risky, ask Elaine to handle. Elaine, her stepmother. Madeline exhaled, blood roaring in her ears. All these years she had accepted the official story. Her mother had no separate assets, no trust, nothing to leave. But now, staring at this hidden draft, she saw it for what it was, evidence of erasure. That night, she walked the 10 blocks to Raymond's townhouse. Snow clung to her coat. Her boots tracked slush through his marble foyer. He looked up from the papers on his dining table, immediately registering her face. "What did you find?" he asked. She dropped the printed copy of the letter onto the wood. Raymond scanned it once, then again. His eyes hardened. "Jesus Christ! They buried it," she said. "Maybe even forged a different will. At the very least, this shows there was an intention to provide for me outside of Charles's control. It's not a coincidence this disappeared. Who had access to these records? Elaine and her lawyer, maybe the executor. But it started with Charles." Raymond paced slowly. "If you want to fight this, we'll need more than one draft. A copy, a mention, someone who can attest to having seen the original. Maybe the notary?" Madeline shook her head. "It's been over a decade." "Then we focus on what we do have," he said. "This, the digital trail. We show it was intentionally hidden. That's fraud, Madeline." She nodded, but her expression didn't mirror his rising adrenaline. It was still carved in something colder. "I don't want just a lawsuit, Ray," she said quietly. "I want the truth out. I want the public to see what they've done, what they're capable of." Ray looked at her for a long moment. "Then we start documenting everything." She spent the next week building a private archive, labeled, time-stamped, encrypted. Every email, scan file, even voice memos, she began recording herself recounting memories, snapshots of growing up under Charles's thumb, of Eleanor's quiet resignations, of the night she was told to pack her things. Truth, not as a weapon, but as a record. The storm outside thickened, but inside her something began to thaw. The house she'd been exiled from was no longer a memory she feared. It was a destination. Madeline hadn't returned to the Cooper estate since the night she was exiled at 20. Back then it had been a bitter December evening, and the wrought iron gates had closed behind her with an almost ceremonial finality. Now, 15 years later, she stood before those same gates again. Only this time, she wasn't the girl begging to be seen. She was the woman prepared to dismantle the facade. The estate loomed like a monument to pretense, all brick and manicured hedges, trying too hard to seem timeless. Snow had gathered along the driveway, untouched. Elaine had always insisted the ground staff take Fridays off. Madeline timed her visit with precision. She stepped out of the car and walked through the side gate, still using the code she remembered from childhood. No one had changed it. Not once. Not after everything. Inside, the air was too warm. Expensive silence hung in every hallway. Her boots clicked on the marble, echoing like a challenge. In the study, she found what she'd come for. The wall safe behind the Van Gogh replica, just as it had been when she was a teenager. She pulled off her gloves and keyed in the 6-digit birth date. Elaine's, of course. Charles was never sentimental enough to use his own. The click was unmistakable. Inside, folders. 4 thick ones, a flash drive, 2 passports, and then a document stamped in red. Last Will and Testament. Eleanor Whitman Cooper. Madeline's breath snagged. She opened it carefully. The contents aligned with the letters she had found in the archive. In this version, her mother had explicitly left a trust for Madeline, independent of Charles. Witness signatures, notary seal, but the most telling detail? It had never been filed with the probate court. She took photos of every page, careful not to disturb the order. Behind her, a creak, barely audible. Her stomach tightened. She turned slowly. Elaine stood in the doorway, lips painted in her signature muted mauve, a glass of wine in one hand. She was dressed as if for an interview. Blazer, pearls, even heels, always a performance. "Well," Elaine said, taking a measured sip, "I suppose the prodigal daughter always finds her way back, though I thought you'd knock." Madeline didn't flinch. "You knew it was here?" Elaine arched a brow. "Of course, I was told to keep it safe." "Safe?" Madeline's voice cracked. "You let them erase her." "I let him erase what didn't serve the legacy. There's a difference." Madeline stepped forward, shoulders squared. "She wanted me protected. You knew that. You helped destroy it." Elaine placed the wineglass down on the edge of the desk and crossed her arms, her posture softening slightly, just enough to be dangerous. She was weak, Madeline. Sweet, yes, but so naive. She didn't understand what it takes to protect a name, a family like this. "I'm not protecting it," Madeline said. "I'm exposing it." Elaine's expression flickered, just for a second. "You think anyone will care? You've been gone 15 years. You're a ghost to them. And ghosts don't inherit anything?" "No," Madeline replied. "But ghosts remember. And this one kept the receipts." She slipped the will into her coat, turned without waiting for permission, and walked out. By the time she reached her apartment, the adrenaline had turned to steel in her veins. She uploaded the photos, labeled each one, cross-referenced them with the previous file from the Raycom archive. It was airtight now. 2 sources, both showing that Eleanor had intended for Madeline to receive what was rightfully hers. The only missing piece? Witness testimony. She needed someone who had seen the will in Eleanor's possession. Someone still alive. Madeline scrolled through her old contacts, the list thinning as years of absence had burned bridges beyond repair, and then she paused on one name. Nancy Holloway, her childhood nanny. Quiet, sharp, fiercely loyal to Eleanor. She had vanished after the funeral. Rumors whispered she had retired out west. No forwarding address, no trace. But Madeline remembered something else. The address scribbled on the back of an old Christmas card years ago, a return label from Colorado Springs. She pulled the card from a box of saved things. There it was. She opened her laptop and typed into a search engine, "Nancy Holloway, Colorado Springs." A listing appeared. A retirement community. Assisted living? Alive. Still alive. Madeline stared at the screen, heart thudding. If Nancy could confirm the will existed in Eleanor's hands before her death, it would be enough to refile, she whispered to herself, a promise and a prayer all at once. Mom, I'm going to finish what you started. The Colorado air was thinner than Madeline remembered, sharper. As the taxi pulled up to the Hillcrest living community nestled against a backdrop of snow-dusted mountains, she caught her reflection in the car window. Her face, though calm, betrayed the strain of 1,000 unspoken truths. She hadn't seen Nancy Holloway since she was 13. After Eleanor's funeral, Nancy had disappeared, just like everything else that tethered Madeline to her mother's world. But now, after a decade and a half, she had found her, and Madeline needed her more than ever. Inside, Hillcrest was quiet, clean, and smelled faintly of lavender and antiseptic. The front desk attendant, a woman named Julie with tired eyes and a warm smile, called Nancy's room after Madeline introduced herself. "She'll see you," Julie said, her voice soft, almost reverent. "She said she's been waitin'." Madeline's heart stumbled. Room 217 sat at the end of a narrow hallway, its door already ajar. She pushed gently and stepped inside. Nancy sat by the window, a blanket across her knees and a crossword in her lap. Her hair was now snow-white, thinner, but her eyes? The same pale green that had once calmed Madeline through 100 sleepless nights were still sharp, still watching. "Well," Nancy said without looking up, "you took your time." Madeline managed a breathless laugh. "You always did say I had a flair for drama." Nancy finally turned her gaze to her. "You look just like her." Madeline walked forward and dropped into the chair beside her, her voice trembling. "I found it. The will." "The real one?" Nancy's face didn't change. "Tucked behind that painting in the study, wasn't it?" "Yes." "I told Eleanor that hiding it there was a mistake. But she was scared, said Charles would never look behind something that didn't scream profit." Madeline leaned forward. "I need your help, your testimony, your memory of what she signed, what she said. I'm going to reopen the probate and bring the truth forward." Nancy's gaze turned distant. "You were 11 when she drafted that will. She made me witness it with her friend Iris, said if anything ever happened to her, if Charles or Elaine tried to bury it, I was to keep her words alive." Madeline's throat tightened. "Why didn't you come forward?" "I tried," Nancy whispered, "after the funeral. I confronted Charles. He offered me money to leave quietly. When I refused, he made sure no lawyer in Atlanta would return my calls. So I left. I figured if one day you came looking, I'd still be here. I had faith in you." Madeline swallowed hard. "Then let's do this, together." Nancy reached over, her thin hand resting over Madeline's. "You don't know what kind of war this will start. I've been fighting it since the day she died. I just didn't know where the battlefield was." Nancy nodded slowly, her voice barely audible. "Then I'll testify. I owe her that. And I owe you that." They spent the next hour revisiting every detail. The date of the will's signing, Eleanor's deteriorating health at the time, her increasing fear that someone was monitoring her calls. Nancy had kept journals, meticulous, dated. She promised to provide a copy. As they sat in the fading golden light of the Colorado afternoon, Madeline's phone buzzed. A voicemail from her attorney in Atlanta. "Call me. Urgent. Your father's legal team filed something unexpected." She excused herself and stepped into the hallway, dialing back immediately. Her attorney, Glenn, picked up on the first ring. "Madeline," he said, tone clipped, "we've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "They're moving fast. Charles's team just filed a petition to freeze any claims on the Cooper estate, citing illegitimate evidence being circulated." Her blood went cold. "They know I found the will." "Not just that. They included a sworn statement from a private investigator claiming the documents were digitally altered." Madeline's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're already trying to discredit me." Glenn sighed. "We can fight this, but it means going public sooner than we planned." "Are you ready for that?" Madeline stared at the door behind her. at Nancy waiting just beyond it, the last living witness to her mother's intentions. Then she looked out the hallway window to the snowy peaks beyond. I don't have the luxury of not being ready. The drive back from Hillcrest to the Denver airport was quiet, save for the soft hum of tires on pavement and the occasional gust of wind cutting across the highway. Madeline stared out the window of her rental car, her mind spinning as fast as the wheels beneath her. Nancy's voice still echoed in her ears, fragments of Eleanor's fears, her desperation, her love. She arrived at Hartsfield-Jackson late the next day, her suitcase heavier, not with clothes but with copies of Nancy's journals, each page a breadcrumb leading back to a truth long buried. As the city skyline of Atlanta rose around her, familiar and hostile all at once, Madeline felt the weight of what was coming settle on her chest like stone. At her apartment, she barely had time to remove her coat before the doorbell rang. Glenn stood there, his suit wrinkled from long hours and his face tight with concern. He carried a folder under one arm and a tablet under the other. "I figured this couldn't wait," he said, stepping inside. Madeline motioned to the dining table. "Tell me everything." "They've filed for an emergency hearing," Glenn began, setting the folder down and opening it to reveal the petition from Charles's lawyers. "They're accusing you of forging the will, tampering with probate records, and attempting to defraud the estate." Madeline scoffed, her fingers curling into fists. "That's rich, coming from the man who buried the real will." "It gets worse," Glenn continued. "They've brought in a digital forensics expert to claim that the scanned copy you submitted was edited, cropped, enhanced, whatever technical jargon they could stretch. They're spinning the narrative that you're emotionally unstable and motivated by revenge." "And Eleanor's original will?" "We'll need to submit the physical copy, the one you recovered. But even that won't be enough unless we corroborate it." "I have Nancy," Madeline said quickly. "She was a witness and she kept journals, documented everything." Glenn gave a slight nod, hopeful but cautious. "It'll help. But it won't stop them from dragging this into the mud." She stood and walked toward the window, the evening sun casting her shadow long across the floor. "Then let them. I'm done playing by their rules." Later that night, she pulled up a social media post from her half-sister, Lydia, Elaine's golden daughter. It was a photo of their family gathered at the Cooper estate, laughing around the dining table under crystal chandeliers. Charles's hand rested proudly on Lydia's shoulder. The caption read, "Family is everything." Madeline stared at it for a long time before replying in a private message. "You left me out of that picture. But I still exist, and I'm coming back." The next morning, she and Glenn met at the Fulton County Courthouse. The hearing wasn't scheduled for another week, but they needed to file the motion to authenticate the will and enter Nancy's statement into evidence. While Glenn handled the clerk, Madeline walked the corridors, each marble tile whispering echoes of old power and new defiance. She passed courtroom after courtroom until she paused outside a wooden door marked Probate Hearing Room B. Her eyes landed on the brass nameplate beneath. Judge M. Lennox, a name she hadn't heard in years. She turned to Glenn as he returned with the receipt of their filing. "Do you know who Lennox is?" Glenn frowned. "Only that he's one of the toughest on the bench. No nonsense. Why? Because he was the judge who sealed my mother's estate the first time. The one who let Charles push it through without challenge." Glenn's eyes narrowed. "That may not be a coincidence." Madeline stepped closer, voice low. "If he's still in Charles's pocket, we're walking into a fixed game." "Then we need leverage," Glenn said, resolute. "Something public, something undeniable." That night, Madeline went to a small Vietnamese cafe tucked in the heart of Buford Highway, an unlikely meeting place for a woman about to start a legal war. But it wasn't comfort food she came for. It was Minh Tran, a retired investigative reporter who once wrote a scathing piece about corruption in Georgia's probate system. And according to Glenn, she'd been waiting for someone like Madeline to come forward. Min, gray-hailed and sharp-eyed, listened without interruption as Madeleine laid out her case. When she finished, the reporter sat back in silence for a moment, then said, "They buried your mother twice. First in the ground, then under paper and silence. Let's exhume the truth." Madeline reached into her bag and handed Min a copy of Nancy's journal entries. "Start here. But I'm not hiding behind anonymity. If this goes public, I go with it." Min nodded. "Good. Because once this story breaks, there's no going back." As Madeline walked out into the night, her breath turned to fog in the cool air, but her resolve burned clear. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a forgotten daughter clawing at a locked door. She felt like the storm pounding against it. The morning of the court hearing arrived with the kind of silence that seemed to muffle the city. No honking, no shouting, just a dull gray sky pressing down on Atlanta like the breath before a storm. Madeline stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the simple pearl earring Eleanor had once given her, one of the only items that had survived the purging of her mother's memory from the house. She wore a dark navy suit, sharp and structured, not to impress, to signal readiness. This wasn't a plea for sympathy. It was a confrontation with truth, a declaration of presence. For years, they erased her. Today, she would make sure no one looked away. The courthouse buzzed with quiet energy, lawyers whispering in corners, court clerks shuffling papers. Glenn met her on the steps, dressed in a charcoal gray suit and holding a slim leather briefcase. He handed her a copy of the press article Min Tren had published the night before. Buried beneath the will, the Cooper family scandal and the daughter they tried to silence. Madeline skimmed it, her throat tightening as she read Min's elegant prose. Eleanor Cooper's final wishes, obscured by greed and silence, may finally see the light of justice thanks to the courage of her estranged daughter. The timing was deliberate. A whisper war in the press right before the hearing. Inside the courtroom, Charles sat flanked by two lawyers. He was polished, of course, expensive suit, that calm, performative poise he had perfected in boardrooms and funerals. Elaine sat behind him, stone-faced, while Lydia kept glancing at the reporters in the gallery. Madeline didn't look at any of them. Her eyes locked on Judge Lennox, who entered without expression. He nodded for proceedings to begin. Glenn opened with the physical copy of the will, dated and notarized by Eleanor and witnessed by Nancy's late husband. Then came the journal excerpts, presented as supporting evidence of intent and context. Finally, Glenn played the audio, a voicemail Eleanor had left on Nancy's landline days before her death, her voice trembling but lucid. "They will fight this, but I need you to promise. If something happens to me, Madeline deserves to know. I trust you, Nancy, please. Keep her safe." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Charles's attorney objected on the grounds of hearsay, but Lennox allowed the statement into the record. "For context," he said, tapping his pen once on the bench. Then Charles stood. "If this circus continues, I will be forced to subpoena my own daughter," he said, motioning toward Lydia, "to defend our family's name." Madeline's voice, when it came, was steady. "You buried my mother once. I won't let you do it again." And for the first time, Charles looked at her, not with contempt, but something closer to fear. The court recessed for a short break, but Madeline didn't move from her seat. The wooden bench felt unforgiving, but she welcomed the discomfort. It grounded her. Glenn leaned in and whispered, "We've rattled him. The judge is paying attention. Stay steady." Across the aisle, Lydia looked shaken. She kept her arms crossed tightly, her usual composure unraveling at the edges. Elaine whispered something in her ear, but Lydia shook her head, visibly agitated. Madeline could almost feel the cracks forming in their alliance. Whatever unspoken pact they once shared was beginning to splinter under the weight of exposure. When the session resumed, a new name appeared on the witness list. Paul Kensington, a former estate planner at Whitford and Bell, the firm that had once handled the Cooper family trust. Madeline had never heard of him, but as he took the stand, her breath caught. Glenn met her eyes with a subtle nod. Kensington testified under oath that he had seen 2 wills drafted by Eleanor, one submitted by Charles's legal team as the official copy, and another, hidden, unsigned, but nearly identical, except for one key difference. The second will named Madeline as the primary beneficiary. Kensington had raised concerns at the time, but Charles had dismissed him. Days later, he was laid off without explanation. Charles's lawyer tried to discredit him, painting him as a disgruntled former employee. But the court murmured. Judge Lennox scribbled notes. Madeline's pulse quickened. Not just because of the evidence, but because it was the first time someone, anyone, stood up in her mother's name besides her. It was the first time Charles looked truly uncertain. Then came the moment no one expected. As the court prepared to adjourn, a woman stood up in the back row, slim with silver-streaked hair pulled into a loose bun. Nancy! Her voice was low, but it cut through the room like glass. "I have Eleanor's letters," she said. "The originals. I've kept them all these years." The courtroom turned. Judge Lennox paused, then gestured for her to approach. Nancy pulled a small folder from her bag, worn with age. Glenn received it with reverence, handing the contents to the clerk. On top was a sealed envelope, Eleanor's handwriting unmistakable. "To be opened only if Madeline comes back." Charles's face drained of color. As the judge reviewed the envelope, he looked up. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning." Outside the courtroom, as Madeline stepped into the crisp, late afternoon air, the weight of everything surged within her, but not as heaviness, as fire. A storm was coming, and she was no longer the girl who would hide from it. She was the one bringing it. The next morning broke clear and cold, the kind of chill that crept past coats and into bone. Madeline stood alone at the courthouse steps. Eleanor's unopened letter pressed against her chest. She hadn't read it. Not yet. Part of her feared what it might say. Part of her already knew. Inside, the courtroom was hushed, reverent almost. The judge entered with slow precision. Reporters filled the back rows. A few familiar faces from the old neighborhood sat in silent witness. Madeline could feel the gaze of 100 eyes, but her focus narrowed to one. Charles. Sitting upright, jaw clenched, his illusion of control slowly slipping. Judge Lennox began by admitting Nancy's documents into evidence. Glenn approached the bench and carefully opened Eleanor's sealed letter. His voice didn't tremble as he read, only softened, as if protecting the words from the courtroom's cold air. "My dearest Madeline, if you're reading this, then you've come back, and for that alone I am grateful. I tried to shield you from what this family became, but silence was not protection. It was betrayal. Forgive me. The truth is this: I changed my will. I left everything to you because you are the only one who ever saw me, not as a Cooper, not as a wife, but as Eleanor. Take what is yours, but do not become them. I love you." Mom, not when breathed. Even the judge lowered his gaze for a moment. Charles shot to his feet. "She was medicated. That letter means nothing without verification." But Madeline rose too. "You mean without control?" Nancy stood from the gallery, lifting another document, a psychological clearance from Eleanor's therapist, signed weeks before her death, attesting to her full mental capacity. The gavel came down once, then twice. Order. But there was no order left to hold. Not in that courtroom. Not in their family. Only truth. And what would be left in its wake. The judge's ruling came swiftly. With the combined weight of Kensington's testimony, Eleanor's handwritten letter, and the therapist's signed affidavit, The court recognized Madeline as the rightful beneficiary of her mother's estate. Charles sat frozen, face slack, as if he no longer recognized the world around him. Elaine quietly gathered her purse and stood, offering no words. Lydia trailed behind her like a shadow, her chin trembling, but not with guilt, only the sting of losing. As they left, Madeline remained seated. Her hands didn't shake. Not anymore. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed, but she ignored them. Nancy was waiting near the curb, her posture quiet and proud. She handed Madeline a small box. Eleanor's locket. Long thought lost. Inside was a photo Madeline had never seen. A younger Eleanor holding her as a baby, pure joy on her face. The other side held a tiny pressed violet, still faintly fragrant. "She kept you with her," Nancy said, "even when they tried to erase you." Later that afternoon, Madeline returned to the Cooper estate one last time. The house was silent, stripped of its power. She moved from room to room without fear. In the study, she paused before the family portrait, the one that had once excluded her. She removed it from the wall and walked it to the fireplace. As flames consumed canvas and varnish, she felt no triumph, only release. That night, she didn't stay in the house. She took a hotel room by the bay. Glenn joined her there briefly, leaving behind the final court documents and a note. "You won. Now live." As dawn broke over Charleston, Madeline stood by the window, watching the city stir awake. Her story had been rewritten, not by vengeance, but by clarity, by voice, by choice. She didn't need their legacy. She would build her own. And somewhere in the stillness between heartbreak and healing, Eleanor was smiling. Thank you for joining Madeline's journey, a story of betrayal, truth, and quiet resilience. We hope it reminded you that even the deepest wounds can lead to powerful awakenings. To those who've ever felt silenced, overlooked, or erased, your voice matters, your story counts. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more emotional dramas that speak to the strength it takes to choose yourself. See you in the next chapter.